We're delighted that you have joined us for this conversation about the making of the classic BBC series adaptation of the beloved Jane Austen novel, Pride and Prejudice. This is the first in a series of 4 conversations around programs coming out of the UK with the focus on the limited series, or what's known in Britain as a serial. BritBox is generously offering this series of events to MOMI's members as a benefit to support the museum and its programming. So thank you to them. We have 4 esteemed guests today, all of them key to the creative process behind the production of Pride and Prejudice. Series writer Andrew Davies has been awarded 5 BAFTAs and 2 Emmys for his wide-ranging work. He scripted the original TV version of House of Cards, on which the Netflix show is based. His film credits include The Tailor of Panama, Brideshead Revisited, and the first 2 Bridget Jones films. His many adaptations of classic literature include Middlemarch, Vanity Fair, Bleak House, Northanger Abbey, Sense and Sensibility, and most recently, the BBC adaptation of A Suitable Boy. 2-time BAFTA award-winning television producer and writer Sue Birtwistle was the executive producer of Pride and Prejudice. Her credits also include Emma, another Austen adaptation, and the acclaimed series Cranford. Simon Langdon directed the series, which earned him a BAFTA award nomination. His other directing credits include the 1982 adaptation of Smiley's People, and more recently, episodes of Midsomer Murders and Foyle's War. Finally, BAFTA and Emmy Award winner Dinah Collin created the fantastic costumes for Pride and Prejudice. Her custom design credits for film include The Bourne Supremacy, United 93, and Gwen. And for television include the BBC's Diary of Anne Frank, Portrait of a Marriage, and multiple episodes of Doctor Who. It is now my sincere privilege to bring them all onto the screen. Please join me. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you and to revisit the production of the beloved 6-part adaptation of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, which first appeared on the BBC in September 1995, just about 25 years ago. For the sake of those who are unfamiliar with the story, and also for fans who love the story, can't see enough of it, and love this adaptation in particular, I think it would be great to begin our conversation today by watching a short scene that establishes the central tension in Pride and Prejudice. That's between Miss Elizabeth Bennet, played here by Jennifer Ehle, and Mr. Darcy, played by Colin Firth, both of whom, it can be said, suffer excessively from Pride and Prejudice. So let's watch that clip.
Only 2 ladies then, after all. Do you know who they are, Charlotte?
Mr. Bingley's sisters, I understand. One of them is married to the gentleman there, a Mr. Hurst.
The taller gentleman?
No, the other.
Better and better. Very elegant. Better pleased with themselves than what they see, I think. Lizzie! Jane! Come here. You see that gentleman there? Lady Lucas has just told me he's Mr. Bingley's oldest friend. His name is Darcy, and he has a mighty fortune and a great estate in Derbyshire. Bingley's wealth is nothing to his. 10,000 a year at least. Don't you think he's the handsomest man you've ever seen, girls?
I wonder if he'd be quite so handsome if he was not quite so rich.
Fantastic. By the 90s, when the production of this miniseries was underway, Pride and Prejudice was no stranger to screen adaptations. I believe the BBC had adapted it 4 times previously. There have been feature films, including one that had zombies in the mix. So while it is a truth universally acknowledged that this adaptation is the most beloved of all adaptations of this classic novel by Jane Austen, why did you all feel it was appropriate? It was an appropriate time in the early 1990s to revisit this story and to bring it to life in this adaptation?
Well, I guess it's always a good time to revisit it. We'd been trying to, Sue and I had been trying to get our version of Pride and Prejudice on the screen for several years, hadn't we?
6 years.
6, yeah. not 16, 6, 6 years. Yeah. I mean, it went. We knew what we wanted to do. Not many people know that Sue used to be my student ages ago, and we talked about it. And when Sue got to the position of being a big, powerful producer, she came and had a conversation with me about Pride and Prejudice, which was really that it had never been done right before, we thought.
It's interesting to hear you say that. So what did you, I guess it was the two of you that got this rolling. So what was it about your approach to this story that you felt set it apart from ones that had been done before?
It had always been considered light social comedy. And we knew that it was about sex and money and hormones and young people and young people's urges. And that's what we wanted to get across. And that's what we did.
We'd actually been...
That's right, isn't it?
It is. I was going to say, we were at a screening together at BAFTA, weren't we? Quite coincidentally. We were on the back row and we watched another Austen. And at the end, we looked at each other and I said, I really want to do Pride and Prejudice because it's about money and sex. And you said, yes, let's do it. And we shook hands on that you would write it and I would raise the money. Yeah. In fact, we didn't want to take it to the BBC, did we? Because they'd done it so many times. And I think we thought that an ITV audience would actually, we wanted it to be open so that they could enjoy it. We knew a BBC audience would go to see a Jane Austen adaptation, whatever, wherever it was. So we took it to London Weekend Television. You did actually commission the first 3 episodes, which you wrote.
Yeah.
And they were brilliant.
Same 3 episodes eventually got shown on BBC.
That's really interesting. I wonder, was there, because that approach, it sounds like it was very distinctive from those that had come before, sort of focusing on this sex and money perspective versus this sort of refined comedy of manners. Was there any pushback about that from the BBC or from ITV in terms of this is sort of holy ground? Jane Austen is, sort of the patron saint, and we can't mess with this in a sense.
There was a lot of funny stuff in the papers because I think it was my fault really, because somebody rang me up about something else entirely that I was actually trying to publicize. And towards the end of the interview, they said, anything else you're working on? And I said, oh yes, I'm doing a new adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. And it's going to be the first really sexy adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. And the Daily Mail got terribly excited and started imagining all sorts of things like naked romps in the hayloft, and they also started ringing up bishops and saying that man Davies is going to do a pornographic version of Pride and Prejudice. Aren't you shocked? And they all said, yes, of course we are. And so we had lots of adverse publicity. Well, we have lots of publicity, it's all good. Long before it ever reached the screen. So it built up quite a bit of anticipation.
I guess I have to wonder then if, because there's really no way to talk about this adaptation of Pride and Prejudice without talking for a moment about the lake scene, the scene where Colin Firth as Mr. Darcy goes for a swim, which is not in the book, as all of us know.
Darcy?
Miss Bennet.
Simon, I would love to hear from you about directing that scene where Mr. Darcy swims and then encounters Miss Bennet afterwards, which very much fits into what you're explaining, Andrew, that approach to the story that focuses more on the physicality and the chemistry. So what was that scene like to direct, Simon?
Well, I thought it achieved what it wanted, but I can tell you there was a certain danger surrounding that particular sequence, because the lake, if you can call it that they actually dived into was not very deep and fairly dirty. And so I think the stuntman that did dive into was taken away and given injections after. So we had to go to a tank in London where we did it instead, and we had a very near, as Sue will tell you, a very near accident there when Darcy dived into the tank, as it does. So we see him dive in, and then of course we shoot it from underneath, so as he was swimming through. Well, so like that. For some reason, which I still haven't come to the point, the tank was covered with three huge, great, I suppose you call them logs, really, to keep it, not logs, or wooden planks, but the planks were held up by iron sort of thongs which came down and were very dangerous. And I remember coming in and saying, when are you going to take they have three big planks up? And they said, well, we'll do it in the next quarter of an hour. They get a truck in to pull them out. So I said, it will take at least an hour or so. I'll go away and do something in the cutting room. And then I came back and found that they'd taken two away and not the third one. And I said, we've spoken to everybody, and this is the first assistant, we've spoken to everybody, it's perfectly all right, don't worry. And I said, well, supposing he hits his head because of the great big iron bars underneath. He said, oh, no, he won't do that. So like an idiot, I said, okay, we'll make sure it's be on your head, so to speak. So he dives in, comes up and bangs his head on these big metal things and brood. And he missed his eye by that much. And he was very, because he did actually accept it. He said, I don't care, I'll look out for it. And we were all very foolishly letting him do it. And he did actually survive. He had a bit of a bruise, but
a producer's worst nightmare.
It was absolutely worst nightmare.
I'd love to hear a little bit about the production's approach to period. Because of course, any historical an adaptation of an historically set novel, you have a lot of choices to make. How much you're going to strive for accuracy, how much creative license you're going to take. So I'd love to hear about the approach in this production. But first, I'd like to watch a clip that I think captures a lot of period details. In the scene, the Bennet family is sitting in their dining room having what appears to be breakfast, and the cunning Mrs. Bennet is hatching a plan to insinuate Jane Bennet into the Bingley household. Afterwards, I hope we can talk a little about what visual details in the scene were historically based and which were creative liberty. So let's have a look at that scene.
From Netherfield? Oh, Jane. Well, what does it say?
It is from Miss Bingley.
Oh, well, that is a good sign, too. Give it to me. My dear friend. There now. Dine with Louisa and me today. La-di-da, 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 la-di-da. As the gentlemen are to dine with the officers. Oh, that's unlucky. Still, you must go and make what you can of it. Yours ever, Caroline Bingley. Very elegant hand.
May I have the carriage, Father?
The carriage? No, indeed. You must go on horseback, for it looks like rain. Then you will have to stay the night.
Mother!
Well, why do you look at me like that? Would you go all the way to Netherfield and back without seeing Mr. Bingley? No, indeed. You Well, go on, Nellie. That will do very well indeed.
That's fantastic. Dinah, I would love to hear from you a little bit about your approach to period costumes and design.
Oh, what a big question. Well, we're looking at this clip, it's very shows very clearly the how we approach the Bennet family. In the research that I did, I went to Manchester Platt Hall, where all the printed cottons are in archive. So we printed, well, at least the daughter of a very old friend of mine, printed fabric for the Bennets, because you can't buy, there's always an element that doesn't work. You need a fine wool, like for Mrs. Bennet then, in order to make their status look right. So we printed dresses, so that's how that, and you can see that clearly in that clip, that they're not fabrics that you find on a roll.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the overall design of the production, and Dinah and Sue, you could probably speak to this, or all of you, was it important to present an historically accurate depiction of the early 19th century, or was there a striving for accuracy mixed with some other sort of visual aspiration?
Shall I speak, Sue?
Yes, do.
Yeah, I think that there is never an accuracy. There is always an understanding of the story and the context. So you choose the elements from your research and for instance, the Jerry's houses, to make the characters, give the characters their identity. Mm-hmm. It can't be authentic, because because it just can't, can it? Because we're now. Yeah. What do you think, Sue?
Well, I think you made it look authentic, so that's what works.
Yeah, that's what works. Yeah.
I mean, there are approaches, and probably some of you have been involved in sort of depicting historical dramas that have wanted to inject a more kind of gritty, what life really felt like. I mean, the Bennet family was middle class. They were not very wealthy. There are other adaptations of Pride and Prejudice, notably, that have pigs running through the front yard, right? So this is not that picture. This is sort of still wanting to retain a sense of sort of polish in a way to their lives. Simon, was when you were working with the production designer Jerry Scott, was there a conversation about how gritty to make it, or was it sort of being depicted according to sort of almost like the rules of the day of how to depict that era in history?
Well, Jerry Scott was probably best art designer you could have. I don't think it should be gritty, actually. I think we made, it's very obvious from, for instance, the houses they live in, what their status is. So you can look at Elizabeth Bennet's house, you can look at Mr. Bingley's house, you can look at Darcy's house, and you can put a price on what their income per year is. Although we tried that, it's quite hard, actually, isn't it, Andrew? What does £10,000 mean today? We tried to make everything look as if, like the fabrics that they wore, whereas you put them next to the Bingley and they're in silks and satins, their jewellery is expensive. So it's just all the things that immediately tell you where you are. And that's part of the story. The fact that Darcy apparently is up there and Elizabeth is sort of there, it makes their story very interesting. I mean, it's I suppose a true love story eventually, that you wouldn't normally expect it to happen that way. And in fact, what's really interesting is that when Colin first read the scripts, I'd sent them wanting to cast him, and Simon will remember this because we asked Colin to come and see us, and he'd just been in a drama in Ireland where he'd had to be very scruffy, and he had a very long coat on, and he had to grow his hair and had a terrible moustache, and they dyed his hair ginger. And I said to Simon, you have to meet Colin because I think I'm absolutely determined to cast him. So he came in to see us, and he walked in through these double doors and sat down, and I'd sent him the 6 scripts, and I didn't realise he'd only read 5 of them because he'd only just come back. And he absolutely loved it. And he said, I've never, ever read Jane Austen. He said, I've resisted it all my life. I thought it was girly, etc. He said, but it's wonderful. He said, I've never read a script like this. I just want to read and read and read and read it. It's absolutely wonderful. Was what we want to hear. I unfortunately said, well, when they get married, and he said, they get married? I said, yes. Really? They get married? How does that happen? And he just had no idea. It was wonderful sort of innocence. And he said, I wish you hadn't told me.
Yeah.
Anyway,
it's how that happened that is at the heart of this amazing drama. I think, Sue, you have, we were speaking about period and about locations and how that communicates about character and story. I think you have some nice visuals there at hand that can help illustrate the locations that were chosen for respective families. It'd be great to see.
Sorry, I thought you didn't want to see these, right? So I will, hang on a sec, here we go. Right, in the middle, that is Bingley's house. Am I holding it so you can see it?
Sure.
Can you? Yes. Bingley's house. Darcy's house. Elizabeth Bennet's house. Just here.
Yeah.
There is another photograph of that. Well, it's while we were doing work on it, actually. So the blue carpet is ours, not the Bennet households. And that's the shot of Darcy's house after the jump in the lake, the dive in the lake, where they meet. Both of them anxious about meeting each other. And while we've been talking about it, that's the lake that was dived into. Andrew, I think we should talk about that scene, don't you? It was the only time we've ever fallen out.
Let's hear it.
Oh yeah, well, I had this idea about this scene. It was never supposed to be a sexy scene at all, and you know, I didn't expect it to become famous. It was like a sort of notion I had. It was really about Darcy, who's very conflicted between his different lives. He wants to feel like a man, like a human being, and his life is very much constrained by a narrow social circle in which he's got to behave very, very socially. And I thought he's coming back from socializing with the same group of people in London. He's going to host a house party at his own house for these very same people. He's got a little bit of time on his own, and he just liked to enjoy his own grounds. And it's a scorching hot day, and he's been riding a long time. He's all hot and bothered. He sees his lake, and he thinks, bloody hell, I'm going to dive in and have a swim. It's my lake. I can do what I like. And I wanted to get away, this idea of getting away from everything, getting into another element, just becoming like an animal in the
Which
water.
I thought all that was absolutely brilliant. I thought it was a brilliant idea. The argument we had was how he went into the lake.
Yeah, well, in those days, men would generally, especially if they were bathing in their own lake, they would bathe naked.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I didn't want
how I wanted him to go
naked.
in. And
I thought it would be less sexy to have him diving in naked, and it really worked out from all the letters that the diving in and then having the wet shirt on still when he saw Elizabeth, that became worldwide, didn't it?
Yeah.
The wet shirt scene.
yeah.
So it was sexy, I think.
Yes, the aftermath was in a way, sexy. I never thought of it like that, but it was certainly made for a good scene. Did you notice, anybody who saw Sanditon, how I got my way finally and had not one but several men
Yes.
diving into the sea, stark naked.
I raised the glass to you, Andrew. I raised the glass to you.
Yeah, got my way at last. Yes.
Achieving nakedness.
Afterwards, thousands of letters that came in from Pride and Prejudice, and there were thousands and thousands, which I gamely started writing by hand, and then realised I'd be there for years. But I so remember there was one from from a 7-year-old called Lisa, and she just wrote, "I love Mr. Darcy." After the show. And then I had one from an 84-year-old woman, whose name I can't remember, but she wrote a very nice long letter about loving Pride and Prejudice. And then she put, "P.S. Mr. Darcy can share my shower any day he likes." I still got
move away from wet t-shirts and talk a little bit about wordplay in the story, which is so central to obviously to Jane Austen's book, is the sort of verbal parrying that happens between the characters. And in any adaptation, there's a need to balance the author's voice while staging a narrative for the camera. So before we talk about this, let's watch a clip where Mr. Darcy and Miss Bennet, Lizzie Bennet, verbally joust while they're dancing. And also in this clip, you can really get a sense of the costumes and how the costumes of the Bennet sisters and the other sort of townspeople contrast with some of the others. So let's see that clip, and then we'll talk a little bit about the writing.
I believe we must have some conversation, Mr. Darcy. A very little will suffice. You should say something about the dance, perhaps. I might remark on the number of couples.
You talk by rule, then, when you're dancing?
Yes, sometimes it is best. Then we may enjoy the advantage of saying as little as possible.
Do you consult your own feelings in this case, or seek to gratify mine?
Both, I imagine. We each have an unsocial, taciturn disposition. I'm willing to speak unless we expect to say something that will amaze the whole room.
This is no very striking resemblance of your own character, I'm sure.
There are a few scenes, there are a few very sort of important scenes that take place while they're dancing together. So Andrew, it would be great to hear a little bit from you, but from any of you about sort of how those essential, meaningful scenes were staged on the screen versus how they played out in the book.
Well, in fact, the dialogue was taken straight out of the book, just pruned a bit. I hardly wrote any lines in those scenes. I don't think I wrote anything that Jane Austen didn't write. I have a feeling, actually, we made it terribly difficult for the actors, because I think most of those dances had periods when the dancers weren't actually dancing. They were waiting for their turn, and that's when most of the conversations took place. But poor Colin and Jennifer had to get their lines in and time them right while they were actually dancing, which I thought they did brilliantly, and it made it all the funnier, I thought.
Well, it was brilliant that Jane Gibson did the actual
choreography.
Apparently, they were both quite good at dancing, but I don't think he was that good, and had to sort of catch up with her, and that he did eventually, but he did find it much more difficult to get into the thing. But I think it was brilliant, absolutely brilliant what they did, and the timing and things like that, considering I'm not sure how much they did have quite a lot of practice, but I know he needed much more.
We had a week off, if you remember, because we filmed for something like 20 weeks and then had a week off, which was because Jennifer was on all the time, every day. Yes. In those, wigs, costumes, all took time. So we took this week, and Jane Gibson, we went to the BBC rehearsal room, and Jane Gibson was there, and everybody was out of costume. And so she started to teach them this dance. And of course, Colin started to behave like Colin rather than Darcy. And like, oh, I'm not sure I can do this. And people started to laugh, and then everybody was losing it. And I was getting very, very anxious. So I stopped the rehearsal and I said to Colin, can I see you in the room next door? And I said to Jane, we'll have a 5-minute break and then we'll start again. So I took Colin in and I actually said, listen, you've got to come back through that door as Darcy. You're not Colin now. You're coming back. And the minute you walk back through, you're Darcy, and everybody will start to behave and do this dance. And so I got Jane to get everybody ready, and I then let him come in. And he came in, I promise, like Darcy, took his place, and the rehearsal was fantastic. It actually got done, because it's a really complicated dance. But
that's a fantastic story. It's so interesting too, because what you're explaining is the contrast between Colin Firth as a person and as a sort of relaxed person, and Darcy, whose physicality was so important to his character, his bearing, and his sort of center of gravity. I guess I wonder, in terms of the writing and the on-screen depiction, were there any accommodations that you had to make to the story in order to accommodate, in order to depict the action on screen? Anything that needed to be shifted? Any sort of big story elements that needed to be shifted around so that you could make them dramatically compelling on screen?
I think, Andrew, you should talk about the letters, because you invented that method, and it was...
Oh sure, yeah, the letters. It's interesting, because I had this big gap between writing the first 3 episodes and writing the last 3, and the first 3 are all scenes, there's scene after scene after scene, and they're beautifully written, and really all I was doing there was trying to show something of Darcy's point of view, Darcy on his own, giving the audience a chance to get to know Darcy a bit better than just always seeing him through Elizabeth's eyes. And then what happens in the second half is everybody buggers off to different parts of the country and starts writing great long letters to each other. And I thought this won't do at all. This is so undramatic. And it was a real big problem. And the particular big difficulty is that huge letter that Darcy writes to Elizabeth after she's emphatically refused him, contemptuously refused him, and he's just in a state, and he writes this enormous long letter. And I thought, how are we going to dramatize this? Well, I thought part of it will be him writing it. It's a big letter. He must have taken quite a long time to write it. And so, you know, I had him write, he starts writing it all dressed up in full evening dress and finishes it with more or less his underclothes.
Night.
And it's dawn.
Through the night.
And it's dawn. It takes him all night, and it's dawn by the time he finishes it. And the other thing I did, which was really, you know, a problem becoming an opportunity in disguise, was the ability to use extended flashbacks so that we got a different perspective on Mr. Wickham, and crucially, we managed to introduce the character of Georgiana, who barely makes an impression in the novel when you're reading it. She hardly gets an appearance at all. She's just a shy girl who plays the piano. But in this, she's a 15-year-old with a crush on Mr. Wickham, and she gets abducted from her school, and Darcy arrives in the nick of time. And is he angry with her? No, he's not. He takes her tenderly in his arms, and the audience think, he's tender with girls.
Good guy.
Maybe there is a chance for after all.
Then he gets rid of Wickham, doesn't he?
Yeah. Oh, and then the other, I turned the letter back to front, the halves of the letter back to front, because then we get the bits of the letter where Darcy is giving his reasons for disapproving of the family. And so we get a lot of flashbacks to Mrs. Bennet being embarrassing, and Mr. Bennet being a bit over satirical with Mary, and generally Elizabeth realizing that her family could be seen as you know, not a very nice lot of people at all.
It's such a fantastic approach that allows you to keep the intimacy of that letter, of those letters, and because they were very important as a tool of communication. But you're able to sort of show point of view, and like you mentioned, flashbacks at the same time. So it's a fantastic device, really, to be able to move from that intimacy of the page and depict that on screen. That's not an easy thing.
Yeah, I had talent in those days, you know.
Also, though, it gave us such a good idea of Darcy. It opened up Darcy for everybody else, because they could say, "Oh, I see. There's been this complication. That's why he was against Wickham." So it gives us stuff that we would only know at the end of the book, and we'd have to look back and say, "Oh, I see."
Yeah.
Right. It's actually.
Can I say something about Andrew's adaptation? I think it has great compassion. The adaptation, that it sort of understands the human condition, which is rather than just being full of manners.
Yeah, well, that was the aim, certainly.
Yeah.
So not just sex and money, but
no, they're difficulties, you know. Yeah. Like the cousin and oh God, and Mr. Oh, the parson. What's he called? Lovely actor. What?
Mr. Collins.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, they're humans. They're not just stereotypes.
No.
Yeah.
So it's not. Yeah. It's brilliant. Just brilliant.
In a sense, we've been talking around this and haven't really taken this head on. But I think 25 years after this 6-part miniseries for the BBC, we're sitting here talking about this. So obviously it resonated with audiences, not just in England, not just in the US, but around the world. And it continues to reach audiences. And I think that exactly what you just raised, Dinah, that the fact that it's not just sort of a beautiful comedy of manners or an adaptation of a beloved book, that there's something inherently human about the portrayals is really sort of the answer to why
it's so touching. I think that's why everybody is so engaged with it. Yeah.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the format of the series. In England, these are called serials, right? When a story is broken up into a number of episodes. In the US, they're more often called miniseries or limited series. So what did you feel? I mean, obviously the BBC had adapted this in serial form before, but there had also been feature films. So there was necessarily no native format for this story. So what did you feel, I guess, Andrew, specifically, that it was about Pride and Prejudice that lent itself to that format? And how did you settle on that number of episodes?
Can I just say before, Andrew, that what we haven't said is why it took so long from being commissioned. I mean, from you and I saying, let's do it. We then decided that we didn't want it to go to the BBC because they had done it. And also they said publicly, they're not interested in period dramas. So we decided we'd take it to London weekend television and on the idea that a BBC audience who's interested in Pride and Prejudice would watch it on ITV, whereas if it was on the BBC, a London weekend audience wouldn't necessarily watch it on the BBC. And we took Nick Elliott, who was running London weekend television, to lunch, because I phoned him and I said, I've got this idea with Andrew Davies, and it's simply the sexiest book ever written. And he was on the phone, he said, oh, what is it? I said, I'm not going to tell you the title. I said, I'll just describe it to you. So I said, well, there's this woman, she's mother, and she's got 5 daughters. And then I went through a bit of and he said, what is it? What is it? I really, really, really want it. So I said, have lunch with us tomorrow. So we took him to lunch. And I remember he was swaying back and to on his chair while we described the story to him about it. And then he got very, very excited. And he said, please tell me. And I said, Pride and Prejudice. And he went, he said, I'll commission it, which he did. And he was only allowed to commission the first 3 episodes, which when he got them, he phoned, he said, these are the best scripts I've ever read and ever will read. And then the chairman of the board refused to allow him to have the last 3. And then it took 5 years from there for me to get the money, to get the BBC to give us the money to do the last 3 episodes. So it was London Weekend who commissioned, as well as later the BBC. But it was a long stretch, wasn't it, from shaking hands in BAFTA?
It was, yes, yeah. And actually after that, ITV saw the point of doing classic dramas now and then.
They did.
And I did Mole Flanders with ITV. That went done quite well.
I feel like the success of this adaptation, do you feel like it ushered in a wave of such historical dramas, or was it like what did you feel was the impact overall on how on the approach to such serials on television?
Oh, sure, it did. I mean, before that, they were seen very much as a minority thing. They had a niche, but it was a kind of small niche, and it, wasn't seen as a very sexy niche. Nobody was terribly keen on doing them. There was a period when they used to be done at kind of early in the evening, a thing like good for children.
I did those, Andrew. I did the 5 o'clock serial. I did Tale of Two Cities, something else as well. Yeah, 5 o'clock. Yeah, on the BBC.
I saw.
What?
Last of the Mohicans, I remember at one stage.
They do that.
That must have been a hard one to do with the wobbly sets and
yeah.
You needed an awful lot of imagination
filming and
it was one set. Well, then you had an interior of the people, and then you had arrows with flames on.
I thought it was very good also.
It sounds like before this, the success of this show, it sounds like, from what I'm hearing anyway, perhaps they had occupied this niche that was more about it was more seen as educational or edifying. Like stories that people needed to know because they were great stories. And what this show did was to prove that, okay, yes, it is those things, but it's great TV. It's great storytelling. It's very appealing. So it opened the doors to lots of other approaches to those kinds of things.
And it got an audience of 10 million, which was what got ITV interested in doing that sort of thing, if we can get that sort of audience. And so, yes, I mean, costume dramas became popular again. I mean, it always goes in phases. I mean, at the moment, you can't get one on for love or money. Everybody's saying, oh no, we're not doing that sort of thing at all. We're doing gritty modern dramas. But they'll have to change their minds. They always do. And it'll come back.
I'd love to talk a little bit, if we can get back to this production for a moment, about casting. So for me, as a fan of the book and the various adaptations that have happened, the casting of Colin Firth and Jennifer Ehle has very strong echoes with the stars of the 1940 film, Laurence Olivier and Greer Garson. I wonder if there was any intention behind that, and whether, and really just to hear about how those two leading characters were selected, whether the chemistry between them was a factor, who was brought on first, etc.
I think we did auditions, didn't we, for Simon, we didn't audition Darcy, obviously, once we'd decided him, but nor the major leading parts. You don't audition Alison Steadman, but for Elizabeth, we did extensive auditions, didn't we?
We did, yes. It's rather vague, I'm afraid, 25 years. But, I can't remember.
Initially, we had them in one after the other, and they'd been sent pages of script which they'd looked at, and they did those for us. And then we weeded it out to about 3 or 4 possibilities. And we liked Jennifer Ehle, but I remember saying, and she must have heard at this stage, I think, something or talking about Elizabeth Bennet, because she had light hair, and talking about Elizabeth Bennet, and she the night before, she darkened her eyebrows. So we'd asked them to come back and be put into costumes, which you'd
Which is what we
sort
did.
of
Yeah.
costumes. You'd applied them and dressed up all the female parts. And so we saw the Elizabeth in costume, and she looked right as well as was good as she had been in the audition.
Which has got a fantastic quality, hasn't she?
Was the chemistry between the two of them a factor in how you selected?
No. They were selected before they'd met each other. They only met each other at the read-through.
Interesting, but they did have
that was quite
chemistry. So that was a very nice. That was a very nice thing to learn. I imagine once you got on set that they worked so well together, that there was really something additive when they were in a scene together. Yeah. I
think the scene, Andrew, the proposal scene, which was again brilliantly written, but that was their first scene together. We had, because of locations, etc., we had to start off filming with that scene. So they first met each other when during that, in that scene, which was really difficult, but I think it was probably quite a good thing, because it's quite fiery between the two of them. I mean, they're arguing. Well, she's arguing with him.
So I have a couple of questions that were sent in by fans. So I'll ask a few of those, and then I'll close our conversation with a final question of my own. So this, I think, is for you, Dinah. Sounds like from a very hardcore fan who knows her historical accuracy. She asks, why did you decide to have Caroline Bingley wear a hat indoors? I thought single women during the Regency period only wore hats outside.
Oh, no, no, she's not wearing the little lace cap as such. She's wearing an adornment, to finish off her outfit. And in a sense, she's right that married women wore a little lace cap. Horrid idea, but they did. But no, she's wearing something more than that, and that's why.
So it's part of her ensemble.
It's part of her effect.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Do any of you, besides the version that you all collaborated on, of course, do you have another favorite film adaptation or screen adaptation of Pride and Prejudice? Any of them that you particularly enjoyed?
I guess the Laurence Olivier one is does have quite a strong appeal. And one of the things I admired about it was the economical screenplay. I think Aldous Huxley wrote it, or he was one of the writers on it. Anyway, to tell that story in under 90 minutes was an exceptional feat, because we had 6 hours to do it and needed them all.
Anyone else have another version of Pride and Prejudice that you
Actually, I loved that version when I saw it. Sort of fell for Laurence Olivier, so much so that when I was about 16, 17, Doreen Munro, head of hockey, said to my friend Diana, who are we all going to marry when we grow up? And one said Paul Jones, who was a singer at the time, Pretty Flamingo. She said, I want to marry Elvis Presley. I said, and I didn't say Laurence Olivier, he'd just taken over as starting the National Theatre. And I said, I'm going to marry the director of the National Theatre, which, as it happens, I did.
Yeah.
I married him.
Reader, you married him. That's fantastic. That's a great.
My friend still has it in her diary, the exact quote of what we said.
Meant to be. And this is a question specifically for Andrew. Andrew, do you have any plans for any more adaptation of Jane Austen's works? since you've done so many?
Nothing is on the cards at present. No, I mean, but you know, it's always slightly irked me that I never got a crack at Persuasion or Mansfield Park, and if anybody invited me to, I wouldn't be able to refuse.
Okay.
Persuasion is a good one.
Yeah, Persuasion is arguably the best of them all, isn't it?
Maybe we should do it, Andrew.
You heard it here first, folks.
Yeah.
And then I have one final question for you all, and I so appreciate you joining us and sharing your stories. It's been a real privilege for me personally, and for our audiences out there to be able to hear from you about this incredible and lasting show. So I'll just ask, if you were to create a screen version of Pride and Prejudice for today's audiences, how or would you approach it differently than you did for the mid-1990s?
I thought we had done it for today's audience.
I was going to say I wouldn't change a word.
Well, that's exactly what I mean.
For me.
No, absolutely not. I think the flavour and the delicacy of it and the fun of it, you know. And I hope they all looked as though wearing clothes, not costumes. So that's the, yeah.
It was also great fun to do, wasn't it?
Yeah.
To be part of it.
Fabulous. Yeah, really fabulous. What special thing. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
I thank all of you so much for joining us today, and really for sharing your thoughts and celebrating this, which we can really call the sort of 25th anniversary of this landmark series. Thank you all so much for being here today.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Fun.